Sick. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to CSS2. So today we're going to be covering like the more advanced chunks of CSS. So after this lecture, you'll be done with CSS and almost done with the basic stack. But yeah, hello, I'm Vicky. I will be teaching today. Sick. So before we start, we can talk about our agenda. So we have a few topics on the list. First, we have positioning and then some specificity, which is a very fancy buzzword that you will need to know. Box model, so CSS box model, display properties, pseudo classes, more pseudo classes, because I know you guys learned some of them last lecture, I'm pretty sure. And then media queries and responsiveness, good CSS practice, and then we'll introduce the first project. And then if we have time, we can work on the homework and the project a little bit if you guys want to, and just like bounce some questions around. But yeah, before we begin, if you ever have any questions, don't be afraid to drop them in a chat. You can either do that publicly or you can PM me if you're more comfortable doing that. But yeah, if you ever want to just cut me off, please do that too, if you're ever confused. But yeah, sick. Okay, so for our first topic, we're gonna start with positioning. So positioning as a CSS property basically concerns the placement of stuff on our screen. So how certain elements move around in accordance to everything else, right? Because you can imagine like on a super complex web page, you want to be able to know like how your stuff is interacting with one another so that if something doesn't look right, you can exactly pinpoint like, oh, this is positioned incorrectly because of such and such reason, right? Okay, so there are 5 main positioning properties. Some obviously you'll use more than others, but I'll just be covering all of them briefly and then we'll move into the demo. Please tell me if I'm ever going too fast or too slow. Yeah, okay. So to start off, we have position static. So position static, this is the default position property in CSS. So essentially what this means is that the elements follow a quote unquote normal flow of a web page. And that sounds kind of like abstract, but essentially what it is it's just, you can just think of it as like, it's just stacking everything on top of each other in a giant list. So it's nothing fancy. It's just the basic default. So if you didn't specify any position, it would just be static, right? And also one thing to note is that when you set the position as static, it's not affected by any top, bottom, left, and right properties that you add to it. So essentially like you can't tell what to do. So usually like, I don't really use this one. I don't think I've ever specifically specified to use static. It's a very niche use case, but yeah, so that's what static is. Next, we'll be moving on to relative. So relative positioning is essentially positioning an element relative to its normal static position. So it's basically static, but you can control it. And that's pretty much it. So like, for example, setting, like in this right example, setting top and bottom will move it relative to its static position. Again, it's not a super flexible positioning property. However, it's pretty common and like usually like if your design isn't too complex, like you can probably stick to this and you'll be fine. But I'll show you guys a little bit of like use cases for each of these. Cool. So next, the third one is fixed. So fixed, one way I like to visualize this is, so sometimes you see like a website that is like super long, like it's just one giant page, right? And then as you scroll down, the nav bar like stays at the top of your page because you don't want to have to like go all the way up to the top of the page to reach the nav bar, right? So the way that they make this nav bar stay at the top of your viewport is by using position fixed. So position fixed basically pins something relative to the viewport. And so the viewport, I think we already covered this, but just to reiterate, the viewport is essentially like everything on a web page that you can see. If you imagine your computer screen as like a box that you're looking into, then that's your viewport. It's just everything that's visible. Yeah, so like on the right example here, the box would stay, yeah, that's a bad example. Ignore the last line, but the box will essentially stay at the top of the screen, 20 pixels away from the top of your viewport, no matter where you scroll on the page. For this position, you can use top, bottom, left, and right to specify like where it should go. And this position, you can also think of it as like, it kind of like layers on top of everything else. So a fixed element is by default like on top of everything else, which makes sense, right? But just important to note that it doesn't leave a space in the page where it would have statically been located. So it's kind of like lifted above everything else. That's like the way I like to visualize it. Cool. And then next we have absolute. So absolute, oh, someone is here. So absolute positions the element relative to the nearest parent. So it basically positions inside of, like, relative to the parent container that it's in. So like if it's wrapped in a div, then it'll position it based on like that div's space, right? So position absolute essentially, it's kind of like, it feels similar to fixed, but it's just relative to a different thing. So it'll like scroll with the page. However, like within the body that it's in, like it kind of just like, it doesn't budge. So the way I like to think about it is that if you, let's say like you want to layer some text over some image, right? If you had set position to be relative, then that's not really possible because your text is going to say like, oh, there's already this image that occupies this portion of the screen, right? And so for that reason, I can't also occupy that same portion of the screen. So what happens is the image and the text will occupy like different sections of the screen. But with absolute, if you place it to be on top of the photo, it'll just go there without any questions. So yeah, one way to easily like specify what should go on top of another is to use the z-index. I'm not sure if we covered this, but the z-index essentially tells you like the up and down direction, like if it was coming out of your screen, like what should go on top of other elements. And yeah, so this is also a position that you can use top, bottom, left, and right to place. And if an absolute element has no position ancestor, so it doesn't have like a wrapper div, then it uses the document body to place itself. Cool. And then lastly, we have sticky. So this one is also very niche. I've never really had a use case where I had to use it. Maybe I'm just a noob, but yeah. So essentially, this one's interesting. It's a lot easier to see rather than me talking about it, but it's relative to the scroll position of the user. So the place, the position that it occupies depends on like what part of the page you're scrolling on. Sticky isn't really itself. It toggles between relative and fixed. So I'll explain more of this later once you get to the demo. It'll make a lot more sense. But similarly to absolute and fixed, you can use top, bottom, left, and right to place it. Once it hits a position on the scroll, it will stick to it. So that's kind of where it gets its name.
If I may interject really quickly, a good example of sticky is nav bars. So let's say your nav bar is in the middle of the screen for some reason, and you scroll up, it'll keep on scrolling up until you're at the top of the screen, and it'll stick there if you specify top 0. So a good way to think of it is just nav bars.
Well, in the case that you wanted a nav bar to start in the middle of your page, yes. I have never done that before, but yep.
I'm just saying
you can think of it like that. Yeah. Thank you, Smart. Okay, cool. So now that I'm done rambling about position, we can go into a small demo about how exactly positioning works, because it is always nice to have the. Yeah, so I sent you guys the starter code for this in the Slack. It's a zip file, so if you guys want to follow along, then go for it. Unless you just want to watch, that is fine too. But yeah, so we have this really, really ugly page here, right? It's horrific, but already you can see some really funky stuff going on, right? So, okay, to outline the HTML document, we have 4 divs, right? And they're each a different color and they're ID'd by their color. And then we have this one giant lorem ipsum default text. Ignore it in general, but it's just there to fill up space. Okay, sick. So diving into the CSS here, ignore this. So we see that each of the divs has a height of 400, so that's why they're like long that way, but we can ignore that. All right, so here we see that this red box is overlaid over the blue box, right? So this usually doesn't happen, but it only happens because we have this position absolute specified for red, right? So if we were to comment this out and then give it a static position, oh no, let me fix this. Okay, perfect. So if we give it a static position and then we reloaded this thing, it would look like this, right? Because it's following the so-called natural order of the page, right? Because red comes first, so it's stacked on top of blue, which is stacked on top of green and pink. Yeah, so that kind of makes sense, right? But if you notice here, we have this left value that is specified to be 20 pixels. So in theory, you know, like there should be like a margin here of like 20, right? However, it's static, so it doesn't listen to you. It's kind of evil. But let's switch to relative, and now we can see that it actually does like listen to the fact that there is a 20 pixel margin here, right? So that's just kind of like a demonstration of how relative and static are fairly similar. It's just the fact that with relative, you can specify positioning, but with static, it doesn't let you. But yeah, and then
zoom in on the text a bit. It is kind of small.
Yeah, for sure. Let me keep my chat open. Okay, yeah, for sure. Is that better?
Maybe a little bit more. That's good. But yeah, maybe you could move the file system to the left.
I got you. Don't worry about it. All right. Okay. Hopefully we can see this. Okay, sick. So notice here we have the z index. Let me rerun this. Okay, so we have the z index as 1, right? So that's what tells the red container that it can be on top of the other container. If we had changes like -10 for some reason, then you notice that it kind of just disappears, right? So the higher the number, like the higher it is on like the stack of elements in your page. So yeah. Okay, so then blue is just, it's just chilling here. We don't have to worry too much about blue. It has a relative positioning. It's not really placed anywhere. It's just following the natural order. And then we notice a little green guy down here, right? He says hello. And notice how when we scroll, he consistently stays there while everything else just disappears from the page, right? So what happens with green is that we've specified it has a position fixed, and that it should go 20 from the bottom and then 0 from the right, right? So this bottom is relative to your viewport. My viewport is just this like Google Chrome window, right? So that's why under here, there's a 20 pixel margin down below that kind of sticks to the viewport, right? So think of it as like you're pinning it somewhere and then it just kind of stays with you. But yeah, and then last but not least, we have our weird sticky positioning. So with that is the pink one. So notice, okay, one way that you can kind of think about it is that the position that so the top value that I gave to pink is 0, right? But notice here that it's not following that yet, right? So essentially any top, right, bottom, or left value that you give the box, that you give the element, if it isn't already in that position, then it's not going to assume that position. So it'll only actually like hold to this top value until like when it reaches it, right? So if you notice, like I scroll up, the top becomes 0, and that's when it actually assumes that position. Like I said, this is a very niche use case. There are very few times in which you'd want something to start somewhere and then end somewhere different. Usually it's like something that's more like graphic design, like artsy. But I've never actually used it in a practical use case, but it is there if you want to use it. Someone asked, can you repeat the z index? Yeah, so yeah, exactly what you said. So if the number is higher, then that means that it comes to the front. And then let's say, yeah, so if you have another absolute, let's see if this will work. Z index is 5. Okay, it kind of messed everything else up, but notice how the blue has a z index of 5, right? And then the red has a z index of 1. So that's why the blue is now on top of this. Let's see. Oh yeah, so if you have the same one, I'm pretty sure it just assumes the order of what it's listed inside of the HTML. So, usually HTML goes that like if you have, yeah. So if you have an element that comes first, it's going to be like slapped on the page first, right? And then the element that comes after it will like be slapped on the page next. So naturally, like the element that comes after, which is blue, will be on top of red. So that's why here they have the same z index, but blue just naturally like comes on top of red. Yeah, so with absolute, it doesn't ever take into account what else is next to it. It just says like, okay, you told me to be here, so I'm going to be here. So yeah, what Jessica asked is it stacked on top of each other? Yes, so it will be stacked. And the only reason why it's coming out of the side is because so if I took away the left position, then they would assume the same position. Just one of them would be over here. Yeah. Okay, sick. All right, so that concludes the demo for positioning. Feel free to play around with it more. There's always more to explore. All right. sick. Okay, before I move on, does anyone else have any questions on positioning? Okay, cool. I will assume that means no. Okay, sick. So our next topic that we'll move on to is specificity. So this is a very fun buzzword that sounds very complex, but it is quite straightforward. So essentially specificity is the art of handling conflicts in your CSS styling. So I believe in CSS1, we talked about a few different ways that we can implement CSS. So, tag selectors, we have class selectors, IDs, inline style, all of that fancy stuff. A lot of the times you'll run into the problem that one element, you might have accidentally styled it with through two different methods, right? So in that case, like what happens when two dudes try to style the same thing, like who wins, right? So there actually is a set of rules that CSS follows when determining like what type of styling to take on. So that is what we'll be talking about. All right, so again, specificity is what it sounds like. It's essentially describing how specific is a method of styling, right? And also how does this affect your code? We must have a way to effectively handle conflicts in a very objective way and to organize our CSS, right? So selector specificity is just a fancy way of saying like, we have this number that is attached to a selector, right? And the number just describes how specific the selector is. So you'll see like an example soon, or several examples soon, but a higher specificity number means that it'll override the styling of another element that is styled by a less specific CSS selector. So a higher specificity always overrides a lower specificity. So yeah, this concept is a little abstract at first, but we have a certain set of rules that we'll follow when determining specificity. So you can kind of think of it as like one giant number that is in base 10. So going from right to left, so at the lowest priority, we have the universal selector. So the universal selector is usually at the top of your CSS file, and that affects every other selector on the page. However, it can be overridden, I don't know, by any of these other types of selectors, right? So it holds the ones place, it's the least important. And then we have tags, and tags hold the tens place. So they can override the universal, but they cannot override classes, which holds the hundreds place, and then ID holds the thousands. And then the style tag is the internal styling. So, like I think we learned this last lecture, but style tags live inside of the HTML. So any internal styling inside of an HTML document will override any external style sheets that are imported into it. So yeah, essentially what we do with these numbers is that when we see a certain selector, we can essentially build a number out of the way that it's selected, right? So I'll show you guys a few examples in the next slide. But once you construct this number, right, then you can kind of compare like with another selector that is also styling the same thing. So another thing to note is that order does matter. So if you have two CSS selectors that are selecting or affecting the same element, the one that comes last will always win. But that's just a general rule. Okay, so to get into some examples so we can better visualize this. Okay, let's just say we have a div with a class name box, right? And it says hello friends. So the tag itself is a div, and then the class has the name box, right? So on the left-hand side, we see a selector that specifies by class name, right? So it's saying, okay, dot box, any element with the class box must have a color red. And then on the right-hand side, we see that it's trying to style this same div with the color green because it's saying like, okay, any div should be green, right? So in this case, we have a conflict because this element assumes both of these, right? It's both a box and a div. So in this case, what do we do, right? So going back to our picture here, we see that on the left-hand side, we have a class selector. So we can represent it with the number 100, right? Because it's just being styled by one class, right? And then on the right-hand side, we have a div, which is a tag selector. So we can give it a number of 10, right? So then in this situation, we're essentially just comparing 100 and 10. So which one wins? The class selector wins. Wow. Hopefully this is making sense, but let's look at a few more examples. So in this example, we have a div and the ID is A, right? And it says spam is fine uncooked, which okay. Our immediate opposition, but I was hoping you guys could overlook my flaws. All right, so on the left-hand side, we can see that there's a selector that's choosing all divs with the ID A, right? And then on the right-hand side, we have a selector that is just choosing the one singular div that has an ID A, only by like specifying its ID, right? So in this scenario, feel free to drop it in the chat which one you think wins while I'm explaining this, but if you want to. But yeah, so going back to our chart, on our left-hand side, we see that there's a div, right? So we have a tag selector and then an ID selector. So going back to here, we can say, okay, the tag contributes 10. The ID contributes 1,000, right? So the total specificity number for the left-hand side will be 1,010, right? And then on the right-hand side, we have a selector that only specifies an ID, right? So going back to our chart, we see, oh, well, the ID holds 1,000, right? So on the left-hand side, we have 1,010, and then on the right-hand side, we have 1,000. So although it's only like a difference of 10, the left-hand side will still win out because it is 10 greater than the right-hand side. So it's these little nuances that kind of make CSS a little bit confusing sometimes because it's such a flexible thing, right? Like there's so many ways to select an element on the page that sometimes it can get all jumbled up. So it's important to have like this system that tells you exactly what should happen in this scenario, right? So for our last example, we will be combining, ignore the typo, we'll be combining two classes, right? So we have this class or H1 with the class box words. So it assumes both the class box and words, right? And it says like and subscribe, guys. But yeah, so on the left-hand side, we see that it specifies the box class, right? Does anyone want to type in the chat or shout out what specificity number this holds if it's just the class? Yes, 100, exactly. So it's specifying by one singular class, right? So it's 100, perfect. And then on the right-hand side, it's specifying by two classes. So what do you guys think will happen here? Yes, precisely, 200, sick, yeah. So this is just, illustrating the fact that, if you specify by two classes, it just multiplies that number by two. So in this case, the box would end up having blue text because the right-hand side is 200, left-hand side has 100, so 200 wins. Yeah, so I guess like hopefully these examples were able to like illustrate a little bit better what specificity means. And during your projects, you definitely might encounter situations in which you accidentally styled something in the wrong way, and you want to be able to pinpoint like why exactly is this happening, right? So keep this photo in handy. I linked the slides to you guys, but reference back to this if you ever get confused. It's a great tool to be able to kind of like debug your CSS. But yeah, cool. Does anyone have any questions on specificity before I move on to box model?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is it always the highest value that wins, or would it be the last input that you put into the CSS file?
Yeah, so if you have two inputs that have the same specificity number, then the last one will win, right? However, if you have two inputs that style the same element, but the last one has a smaller specificity number than the first one, then the first one will still win. So essentially, like ordering is even like lower on the scale. So like order does matter, but only if the two that you're comparing have the same number. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, for sure. So if you specify 10 for classes, wait, sorry, what does specify 10 classes mean? Is it the same as specifying an ID? Oh, wait. In the CSS.
I think she's asking if like you have like 10 classes versus like an ID, like both of them will have the same point value.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I think, okay, that is a great question. I've never encountered a time where like you have like 10 of the same class, like, or 10 selectors styling the same thing. This is a good question.
Oh, I
I
know this one.
believe
It's
that
if I may
ID
interject,
wins, right? I thought ID wins, right?
ID wins, but if
Yeah.
you have a bunch of classes assigned,
Yeah.
it's the last class. It's like the last class you tell it to be that wins.
Oh, well, yeah. So between the 10 classes, it's the last one that wins. But if you had an ID versus 10 classes, oh, okay, yeah. So ID versus 10 classes, ID always wins over classes, right? But within the 10 classes, since all of the classes have the same number, then it's the last one that wins, like Samart said, yeah. But
Yeah,
hopefully,
these numbers aren't actually hard and fast. If you have like
yeah,
3,000 classes in one ID, the ID will win. This is more of like an analogy to help demonstrate it, but like whichever one you use will always override the bottom, like what the lower priority classes or
yeah.
IDs. Like if you use a style tag, it'll always override IDs, no matter how many IDs you assign it.
Yeah, also one thing to note is that please never use 10 selectors to style the same class. You know, it might happen if you fall asleep in a keyboard and you press paste a bunch of times, but hopefully we'll never encounter that situation. But yeah, cool. All right, does anyone else have any questions on specificity? Okay, cool. Awesome, okay. So next topic is the box model. It's all a box, always has been. Okay, anyway. So essentially the box model is just a nice way to represent objects in your page, right? So a box model is essentially a box that wraps around every HTML element. So on the right-hand side here, you can see if you are familiar with DevTools, and you might have already seen this guy before, but he's a very nice tool to help us visualize what is going on in our elements, right? So let's start with the width and height. So there's basically 4 sections. There's the content size, which is specified by width and height. Then you have padding, border, and margin. So to start off, width and height directly affect the size of the content in the box. So I like to use the gift box analogy. I say that like I've used it, but I just came up with it today. But essentially it's like you have a gift, right? So let's say there's a very valuable fine china plate inside of this box, right? They're gifting to someone. And it has the size, you want it to have the size 128 pixels across, tall, and then 512 pixels across. Pretend like you can do that. But yeah, so this is just essentially styling the width and height of the actual content inside the box, right? Next, we have padding, which if you want to think about it in the analogy, it is like the packaging peanuts or the tissue paper that protects it, right? So the padding affects the space between the actual content itself and the container that contains this content. So the way that you specify padding is you can do it in a few ways. So you can give it just one number and it'll put 16 pixels on all of the sides. Or you can give it 4 numbers, and the order that it goes in is top, right, bottom, left. So the top would have 10 pixel padding, the right would have 12, bottom would have 34, and then the left would have 15, right? So if for some reason you wanted to do that, that's an option. And then you can also just specify one side. So padding right, if you give it 20 pixels, it'll only affect the padding on the right side. Yeah. And then next we have border, which is the wrapping paper in the gift analogy. So the border wraps around both the padding and the content. So in this example, you can just, by specifying just the word border, you can pass it in 3 values. So the first value is going to be how thick the border is. The second value is like the pattern. So solid is just a solid line. You can have dotted, you can have dash. I don't know what else you can have, but those are options for you. And then lastly, you have the color, which is green in this scenario. Next, lastly, we have margin. I don't know how to put this in an analogy. Maybe it has to do with like the number of gifts you got. Like if you got less gifts, then you'd have a larger margin. But let me know if you have better ideas. So the margin is essentially the amount of space between the entire container, so the entire box, and elements around it. So it doesn't concern anything internal. It's just saying like, oh, I have another element next to me, I want to be 6 feet apart from it, right? Social distancing. Margin is also specified in the same way that padding is. So you can give it one number, or you can give it 4 numbers, or you can specify just one side, just like with padding. Nice. Okay. So one handy way of checking what the box model for your element looks like is by using DevTools. They're available in every browser, and it displays the box model layout for you. Notice that dude, he's still there. So yeah, let's hop into a demo and see how this works. So here we are on the same, we're on the same doc as before. I mean, same code file as before, the positioning-demo file. So we're going to be playing around with this pink dude right here. All right, so let me uncomment all of this. So here, we're gonna make it look really interesting. All right, now let's open up DevTools, right? Okay. All right, so we can select this dude. So yeah, we've given it a margin of 100 right here. So that's why we have this space around it, right? So like I said, this is the box itself. And then the margin concerns pushing it away from everything else on the page. And then next we have the border. So we gave it a width of 20 pixels and it's solid and it is black. And then we also can give it a border radius. This is something I did not mention in the slides, but border radius is essentially just the rounding of the corners. If you notice that, like here it's rounded, and if you give it a lower border radius, it'll be more pointy. So now it looks like this. But border radius is super trendy right now in design. I know, like everyone loves using some thick border radius just to make it look like more modern or something. But yeah, it's nice to know. And then next we have padding. So padding just concerns how much space there is between the top of this box here and then the actual content, which is the text, right? So inside of the DevTools, you can select your box, and down here it tells you exactly what I specified on the side, right? So the margin is orange and it says 100, just like I said here, and then everything else just follows, right? So this is a really nice way to not only see like what exactly is going on here. So like if something is not the right size, you can say like, oh, the margin is why there's a problem, or the padding, right? And then another nice thing is that you can go directly into the style and just say like, so let's say I want to give it a smaller margin and see what it looks like. So you can do that in here as well. And it's just a nice way to be able to test what is wrong with whatever you might be building. But yeah, that is the box model in a nutshell and how to conquer it in the DevTools. Yeah, so that's all for the demo of this portion, pretty short, but does anyone have any questions on that? Okay. Amazing. All right, sick. All right, so next topic, we will be talking about display properties. So this is essentially just specifying a way to make all of the elements on your page work together. It might be a little bit confusing because we just learned about positioning, which kind of concerns a similar thing, but display is a different property. And I'll show you guys the 4 different ways, or the 4 most common display properties. Display can assume a lot of different values, but I'll just be talking about the 4 that are most commonly used. Cool, so that I already talked about. All right, so here are the 3, if there's 4 of them, and like let's say they're siblings, we have one favorite child, and these 3 are just kind of like vibing here, but they're good to know. So display block essentially displays an element as a block element, right? Like a block element just kind of goes onto a new line on the page and it takes up the entire width of the viewport. Display block is the default, versus display inline, which takes an element and puts it in the same line, right? So like if you had a span inside of a paragraph, then it goes in line with the paragraph. So it doesn't like create like a line break. And an important thing to know about inline is that it's super rigid. You can't give it a height or width property. It just says like, oh, hey, like this is the height of the line and this is just what I'm gonna do, right? So it doesn't listen to you. And then next we have display grid. So display grid is more niche. I've never really had to use it, but it is what it sounds like. It's essentially just putting stuff in a grid and you can specify like rows and columns. It's a very easy way to go about that. So let us move into demo for just these first three. Why is this not working? These first three. All right, sick. So now we're moving on to a new file. So we're going to be going to the display-demo file if you want to follow along. Let me just pull it up here. Okay. So in this HTML file, we have specified 4 divs. So we have a red guy, blue, green, and pink, just like before, but now they're doing different things. So let's go into our CSS. So right now, it is a grid. That is not necessary right now. Yeah, so let's just give it a default and have it just be like block elements, right? So right now, what is happening is that it's assuming the default, right? So like I said, the default is block. So every single one of these divs doesn't go in the same line. It'll just start a new line every time a new element is added on the page. So that's kind of what block does. And then if we were to give each of these child elements a display of inline, notice what happens here. First of all, it'll get really small and it'll go into the same line as the other inline elements. And the reason why it gets small is because, like I said, you can't specify any width, right? So, or any height. So usually this div is what's telling it to be 100 tall and 300 across, right? But since it's inline, it doesn't work anymore. So that's why it's small. But yeah, let's return to this. All right, so then that's what inline does. And then for the last one, we have grid. So grid is a property that you give the parent element. So both inline and block you can give to the children, right? So these 4 are considered a children. And then our parent is the body, which has class body. I don't know, that's a little bit redundant, but so essentially now when we want to say, hey, be a grid, we're gonna tell the body to like be of a grid, right? It's a little bit confusing, but essentially the body is what contains these things. So we have to tell it, hey, take all of your children and put them in a grid, because it wouldn't really make sense to give each of the children a grid property, right? So let's see. So we're going to tell it to be in a grid. So there we are, right? And the reason why it automatically jumps to 2 is because we can specify how many columns and how many rows we want, and also at the same time specify the size, right? So what's happening here is that this is the property for the number of columns, and we're saying we're passing in 2 values to it, right? So because we're passing in 2 values, we're telling it, hey, we want 2 columns. So that's kind of implicit. And then each of these values just assumes like the size of the column that you're making, right? So both of them have column auto, which takes the width and just divides it by 2 and puts it in a grid, right? We can also say, let's have 4 columns. So the first one will have size auto. So that'll be 1/4 of the width. The next one will have 100 pixels. And then these last 2 are of an art. We don't need to know this, the FR right now. But now you'll notice that they're all in one row. However, they're all like sized differently. And then lastly, we can cut that last box and just put it onto a new row. So yeah, that's grid for you. Again, it's a niche use case, but it's always good to know, like in the case that you want to create just like a grid on your page. Yeah, so those are the 3 less used, or like are the ones that like we tend to use at least. I will now introduce the one that we all know and love, and that is called flex. So flex is our favorite display option. Yes, we do pick favorites. It'll make your life a lot easier. I think flex is one of the like single-handedly most important display properties to know when structuring a page. It makes it easier to design flexible, responsive layout structure without having to specify like positions. So flex, it sounds kind of abstract right now, but all you need to know is that it's flexible and it basically will satisfy like most of your positioning or display needs. I use flex for pretty much everything, unless it's very niche. But yeah, you can specify like the direction of the flex, so you can make it into a row or a column. You can give it space in between. You can center it, so you can justify it and align it to your screen. Yeah, so this is a very commonly used display property. And now, instead of talking about it, we will look at a very fun exercise that we love here at WebDev. So it's called Flexbox Froggy. Essentially, it's just a bunch of frogs, and you're going to use display flex to position these frogs to get them onto like their lily pad homes, right? So let's take a look. All right, I don't know why I'm on level 24, but okay. So if we go on the first level, right, we'll notice that we have this little dude right here. So we have this little dude right here, and he just needs to get home, right? Poor guy. So it's going to tell you like, okay, we have some hints here, right, on like what kind of stuff you need to use to get him here using flex. So as we notice, we have already specified that the display of the frog will take on flex, right? And after a few rounds of this, you'll see the power that flex holds. But yeah, so in this case, it's saying, okay, guide this frog to the lily pad on the right by using the justify content property, right? So that tells us that we should use justify content. And justify content takes on several different values, right? So flex start aligns it to the left side, flex end aligns it to the right side. Already we're seeing that we should probably use flex end, right? So after we do that, we'll see him move over. And now we can progress to the next round. Now we have two dudes, right? I ignore that, who need to get home. And for this one, same thing, justify content, and we'll say center because now we want it to line up with the center of the screen. So justify content moves it horizontally. Then later on, you'll see align items, which moves it vertically. But yeah, let's see what else we have in store. Okay, so now we have three dudes that we want to kind of space them like in an even way, right? So again, we're going to use justify content like it says, and then let's see what else it can take. Space between and space around are some options, right? So the difference between space between and around is that space around will count the sides of the screens as elements too, so it'll put some space around the flex box, right? Like the name says. So that's what we're going to do, and now we can see. Okay, so you kind of get the gist. This game is really helpful for just like learning Flexbox in general. It's super thorough. By the end, I like you hit some levels that like I don't really even understand like how I would initially approach, but it is very helpful. And Flex is something that has a lot of depth. Like you can do a lot of things with it. You can combine like all these different properties to make it look like anything that you want pretty much. So this will be actually a part of the first project, is just to get through this, because after you get through this game, you'll essentially be a Flexbox god. But yeah, so that's the intro for Flexbox. Like I said, it gets a lot more complex, but I think just going through this level by level will be very good practice for you guys. But yeah, cool. So does anyone have any questions on display or Flexbox? Okay. All right, sick. Oh yes, okay. Do you need to specify flex in the parent or the children? That's a good question. Yeah, so you're going to specify it in the parent. So what you specify in the parent will affect like the way that all of the children are positioned. So I think in this example, we notice that it says the ID is pond. So the pond, I assume, is just this like blue box here, which is the parent element. Good question. Okay, we can address any more questions later, but let us move on to pseudo classes and animations. So this is some of my favorite stuff because animations are just a really nice, like very actually simplistic way of just making your website look a little bit more fancy. Like hover animations just really sell it. I always default to those, but essentially we'll be learning how to use pseudo classes to implement animations. And yeah, cool. So pseudo classes, we've learned a few of them, but essentially to reiterate, a pseudo class is used to define a special state of an element. So for example, when you hover over something, that's a special state, right? So you can give it a different CSS property. When something is in focus, so when you had clicked on something, or the first child of the list. Some more pseudo classes that are more specific to anchor tags are active. So active essentially, it occurs when you are holding your mouse down on a link. So it's very specific. Link is for unvisited links, and then visited is for visited links. You can kind of think of it like if you do a Google search and then you click on a link, the next time you do the same Google search, the link that you've already clicked on will be like purple instead of blue. So that's how that is done. But yeah, so those are pseudo classes. Pseudo classes can be combined with the property transform to do some fun animations, right? So essentially what happens here is that on hover, you're going to give it, so this is another CSS selector. So on top of this would be a regular dot box selector. Then under it is what happens on the special state of hover, right? So when you're hovering over this box, this basically says that it's going to rotate it by 20 degrees and scale it by 2. So transform is a CSS property that allows for animation specifically, and it has a multitude of different values that it can take. I would go online and search up the rest of them because I will be only introducing 3 of them, I think. But yeah, so by combining pseudo classes and transform, you can do some fun animations. So in this example, it would rotate it by 20 degrees, and then it would make the entire thing bigger by a scale of 2. And there are other ways to do animations like on-click animations or scrolling animations using JavaScript, but we'll cover those once we actually get to JavaScript. Right now, you just need to know that CSS can give you the option to do some very basic animations. So another thing to note is that transform is often used with transition. So essentially transform is the action that actually happens, right? And then transition will select one of the changes. So in this example, you see that transition selects transform, right? And it says, it gives it some other fancy properties, right? So for example, it's gonna say, okay, so we have this transform here, that's gonna scale it up by 1.5, right? And then in the actual original element, you have a transition property that says for anything that changes between box and box hover, right? You're gonna give it like these properties. And so in this case, it only selects transform to give these properties, right? And what these properties are is that the 0.5 represents the length of the transition. So how long this animation will take. 0.25 specifies the delay. So let's say you hover over something, it'll wait 0.25 seconds before it actually does the animation. And then ease is just a style of transitioning. There's such thing as like ease in and ease out. They're very subtle, like the differences, but it's worth exploring like what those are. And yeah, so we can notice here that in the original, it says the box has a width of 40, right? And then in the hover, it has a width of 50. So after you hover on it, it will like expand in size. However, it will not take on these properties because this transition only specified that transform will take on these properties. It's a little bit confusing to grasp at first, but just know that transition is a property that will go in the original element. Transform will go in the later, in the pseudo class. And then transition will just tell transform how to transform essentially. So to move on to demo, we can open up the pseudo class demo file. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so in the HTML, we just have two dudes. We have one red guy and then one green guy. They're just chilling. Some funky stuff will be happening here. But yeah, so in our CSS, we notice that there's two classes, or two selectors for each box, right? So one, we have the regular selector that tells it be the background red. And then for this red dude on hover, we want it to be yellow, right? So that's why this is happening. So once we hover over this div, this guy is now yellow. Nice. And then for this green guy, he's a little bit more fancy, right? So actually, no, before we move on to the green dude, notice here that the red element, when you hover, it kind of just snaps into place, right? And that's actually because we don't have a transition element inside of our red. So if we were to give it a transition property and say, okay, I want to say background color. So this is specifying which transformation or which change we're going to be affecting. And then I want it to last for 1 second, but I don't want it to happen until 0.5 seconds after I hover. And then let's say ease in, right? So then here, okay, ignore that. When you hover, it'll now take 0.5 seconds to start and then 1 second to finish, right? So I'm gonna wait. Okay, so now we can see how it like fades in instead of obnoxiously just like snapping, right? So you can think of transition as a way to style animations. Okay, so now moving on to the green dude. So if we look at the code, we can kind of predict what will happen. So before anything happens, he's green, right? And transition will take 2 seconds, but we'll wait half a second, right? And then on hover, he'll turn pink, and then it'll rotate 100 degrees, move down, and then also scale by 1.5. So it's gonna be kind of jank, but yeah, that's what he's doing. So yeah, you can notice that it's not cute. I don't know, like if you'd ever want to do this, but it's an option for you. Yeah, so what's happening here, you might notice that in the transition, we specified all, right? So all is just a way of encapsulating every single change, right? So I want both the background color and the transform to hold these properties, right? So if we said instead, I just want transform, then you'll notice that the pink will snap in while the movement will still like take 2 seconds, right? So the pink immediately happens and then the transformation happens, right? Because we specified that we only want the transform to hold these values. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Animations are super fun to just play around with. So if you ever have free time or in your project, if you want to make it really extra spicy, that is something you can do. But yeah, okay. Does anyone have any questions on this demo or animation in general? Okay, awesome, then we can move on. All right, okay, so the last actual, okay, this has been a lot of information, but the last actual topic that we'll be covering is media queries. So media queries make things mobile and make them size differently. So they allow you to change the CSS properties of the page based on the size of the screen, and actually based on like a lot of other stuff. But typically the use case for this is if you want to make something responsive, then you'll go first to media queries. Later on, you guys will be learning Bootstrap. So that's like a library that has responsive layouts. But if you don't want to use Bootstrap, which I am anti-Bootstrap myself, don't tell Samar unless he's here. I don't know if he's still here. But yeah, so you can basically just change stuff based on the size of your screen. So you can imagine how this is helpful because so you have a really dense website and it looks perfectly fine on your like 15-inch MacBook, right? But what happens when you put it on your phone, right? So how are we going to account for that? So that's what media queries give you the power to do, is to change the size of elements, change the directions of elements and colors of elements, even if you wanted to, based on the size of your viewport. And you can actually also specify or check the height of your viewport as well as the resolution, and even the orientation of the device. So if you were to flip your phone horizontally, you can also specify like what should happen then, right? So it's very powerful. You can add as many different media queries at the end of your CSS file, and this is what they look like. So you have this @media rule, right? So this is just purely syntax. I don't know this off the top of my head, but this is what it looks like. So here you'll specify max width, and then use any one of these. I don't know what they're called, logic operations, and then specify like a height, right? So you have like ultimate flexibility in what kind of stuff or like what kinds of screens you want to affect. So in this scenario, like if you reduce the screen down to 600 pixels, it'll change the background to light blue. And anything above 400 pixels in height will also have this light blue property. So here are some common breakpoints that you'll use. So breakpoints are just like this value here that specify like, hey, if I'm on a phone screen, I'll usually be in between 320 and 480 pixels wide, right? And then if I'm on a tablet, I'll be between 481 to 768. And you don't have to use these breakpoints. You can specify any number of pixels, but it's nice to have these just to have like a good baseline to build off of. So that when you're actually implementing it, it'll just be laid out for you and you can have this to blame instead of your own breakpoints. But yeah, so moving on to a demo for media queries, I will be actually pulling up the WebDev website itself. Here she is. So ignore how messy it looks right here, but let's take a look. So here on our projects page, let us notice that we have this giant grid of our past projects, right? Very, very cute. Very nice. But you'll notice that it's in a grid. And then when we size the screen down, you see that it moves, right? So it actually just turns into one giant column now, right? So this is what media queries allow you to do, is to even like change just the orientation of the way that things are laid out on the screen, right? Oh wow, this is new. That's cool. So yeah, so right now it starts as a grid, but notice in our code that we specified, as soon as it hits a width of 675, your viewport hits this width, it's gonna change flex direction to column, right? So that's what's happening here. We're gonna keep going down, and once we hit 675, which is here, then all of these will be laid out in a column now instead of in rows. So that's just one example of media queries. Another example, it's not very well implemented. Don't shame me, but this photo doesn't really make sense to be laid out like this on a mobile device. So the photo itself entirely just changes when it's mobile, right? So it's just a completely different graphic. So that's another thing that you can do, is just like completely hide things away. Another example I will pull up is, I did a freelance project, just like coding this site. And you'll notice that like this nav bar here is just chilling until you shrink it to a certain size, and then it turns into a hamburger menu, right? That is weird. I don't know what they did there, but yeah. So that's another example of how you can use media queries to literally change what is on your page, right? But yes, hopefully those examples illustrated well what it can do. Yeah, does anyone have questions about media queries? So we're running out of time, so I'm moving a little fast here. Feel free to drop them in the chat if you do, otherwise I'll move on. Okay. All right, so writing good code. So we all know that, coding is an art, right? You have to be able to write it in a way that makes sense, not only to you, like when you look back at it in 2 weeks, but also to other people that might be contributing to your code base. So CSS has, there's certain practices that you should take into account. So I'll just introduce 4. There's obviously more, but like these are the ones I've most encountered in my time. But so first off, upper left-hand side corner, you can combine redundant code. So let's say you have a bunch of selectors that all just say, hey, like make the color green, right? there's no reason to make 3 separate selectors. You can combine them using commas so that all 3 of these will have a color green, right? So this is just a way of like, first of all, shortening your CSS file and also like organizing in a way that kind of isn't redundant, right? So people have to waste less time like searching through your code base. Right below that, we have commenting your code. This one, you know, it applies to any language that you're working in, HTML as well. But if you notice, like Samart did a great job at putting comments here. So what is a text overlay, right? So he specifies in a comment that this is just the overlay for the div that contains the text, right? And it's really helpful. Like he built this code base out first, and then I went back to update it. And it's quite nice to be able to see like, okay, this is what this does, so that if anything looks wrong, then I know exactly where to go to fix it. So this is how you comment your code. It's just a / with a star, and then a star and another / to end it. Yeah, and then upper right-hand corner, we have structuring your code in a top-down manner. So that means like all the CSS stuff that affects like the navbar should go on top. Then all the CSS styling that affects the main content should go in the middle. And everything that affects like the footer should go at the bottom. So your CSS file should follow the flow of your web page itself, just so that, you know, if someone wants to locate like, hey, I want to update the footer, right? They know to like scroll to the very bottom to get there. And then lastly, using multiple classes is a good way to organize your code. So let's say you have 10 box elements, right? But like you have one that you want to be green instead of red, right? So instead of, you know, writing out another class for it, you can just append another class on top of the current one so that it holds the same properties as box, but you can just change like one of the properties instead of all of them, or having to like write all of them again. So yeah, that's the power of using multiple classes. But of course, there are other good practices to follow when writing CSS code, but these are just the 4 that I personally find the most helpful. But yeah, that is actually all for this lesson. You're done with CSS now. That was a lot of information that I just threw at you. But okay, so before we move on to introducing the project, I just want to like get a vibe check on how you guys feel about this content. If anyone has any questions on like literally anything that we covered, right now is the time to ask. So yes.
I'm just curious about one thing here. The last thing you said about appending a word to a class, can you just write a random word, or do you have to append another class, or how exactly does that last feature work?
Okay, yeah. So, all right, let me write out an example. Okay, so let's say we have, let's use this guy. Oh gosh. Okay. Well. Okay. Sorry, let me fix this before we actually. Okay, so let's say we have this this green guy. Oh no. Wrong thing. Oh, someone asked, what happens if we miss a grade script deadline? Honestly, just let Urban or one of the teachers know. Not the end of the world. Because we understand you guys have classes and life outside of web dev, so that's totally fine. Just let us know. And if you guys ever need help on any of the assignments or it's like taking extra long, then like be transparent and we will help you through it. But yeah. Okay, anyway, back to this example. Let's just say there's a ton of green guys, right? That have okay, so we have a ton of green guys here that have width of 200, right? But instead now I want to have a green guy. I want to have another element that holds all of these properties. So it looks exactly like this, except I want it to be yellow, right? So let's say we want it to be the last element. So the ID here, let's actually make this class. Ignore this inefficiency. Okay, that was just a mistake. Right now. All right. Cool. So we have a bunch of green dudes. I want the last one to be yellow, but I still want it to have a width of 200 and a height of 50, right? So instead of saying like, okay, let me make another class here, and I'm gonna call it yellow, right? And then I have to go down here and say yellow. I want it to be of width, like essentially just having to copy all of this and then say background color yellow, right? So this is one way you could do that. That's not even right. Right, so this is one way to effectively achieve this, right? But notice that this CSS code here is the same as this. It's just the only thing that is different is the color, right? So instead of doing this, let us delete that. You can just, on this class itself, you can append another class, right? So the way that you append a class is just by adding a space in between. So that's what's gonna say like, oh, it's both class green and yellow, right? So then instead of doing what we just did down here, you can specify, I want a new class called green.yellow, which has background color yellow. So it only changes a property that we want to change, right? And we get the same result here. You don't see the change because it's the same. But yeah, so does that kind of make sense? Like you're essentially just adding another class in so that you can more specifically select that one and then only change what you need to change. So you don't have redundant code.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Okay, for sure, yeah. Okay, the parent-child part. Okay, so the parent-child. Yeah, so in this, let's say in this example, we would consider all the children to, let's be less obnoxious here. Let's consider all the children to be like these divs, right? So I guess, all right, so these three are the children. And then we would consider the parent of this to be the div that immediately wraps it, right? So in this case, it would be just the default like body tag, right? So in this case, the body would be the parent, and then all its children are all just the elements that are nested inside of it, right? So yeah, does that make sense?
So is like child basically the ones that are like indented into it?
Yeah, so the child is like, yeah, it's just relative to like the part of the code that you're talking about. So like it's just a concept. The child as a concept is just the nested portion of like what is around it, right? Yeah, so the indented parts, exactly.
And so by parent, it's not like what we know in CS, which is like the root or something. It's just whatever's like the immediate bigger thing, bigger tag, I guess.
Yeah. So like the immediate is called the parent, and then anything above it is the ancestor. So I mean, like you can reference it similarly in CS, but you know, in parent we just mean the immediate wrapper around it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So before we run out of actual time, I will introduce a project. I will also post this spec here for, wow, where did it go? Project. I will post the spec in the, like, or okay, ignore that. I'll post the spec so you guys have a hold of it. Also, it is in our education folder, so you can find it in Notion. But so we have two components to this project. It's not a super long, demanding project, so don't be too turned off by this. But so the first part is just doing Flexbox Froggy. Like I said, it's a super good way to just get a hold of what Flexbox does for you, and you'll realize ultimately why it is our favorite child. And all we want you to do is finish all 24 levels. It sounds like a lot, but a lot of them are related to each other. And then once you do that, be like Samarth, take a selfie with it and submit it on the Gradescope. And yeah, for our actual project portion, we have basically just an application of HTML and CSS. So you're just gonna make like a news site essentially that looks something like this. And it doesn't have to look exactly like this. Like the font doesn't have to be this weird stuff. You can make it look like whatever you want as long as it has like these components inside and you know like why everything looks the way that it does, right? So to clarify, these are buttons down here. I think you link like the actual website. Yeah, so you can look in the project spec and find like the actual demo to it. These don't actually link anywhere, but yeah, so that's the project one. There are some tips and guidelines I won't actually go over. But the biggest takeaway for this project is that, first of all, you'll be applying your HTML, CSS knowledge. And also don't ever be afraid of searching stuff up online. So if something doesn't look right, literally just Google it and most likely Stack Overflow will tell you exactly what is wrong. Also, use DevTools a lot because getting comfortable with DevTools, although it looks a little bit scary at first, will help you a lot in the long run. It's a great way of like really digging into your code base and seeing like what is being displayed. So yeah, that is a project. I'm not wait, when is the due date? You know, the due date is sometime later. It is not soon, but we'll update you guys on the specific details of this soon. But in the meantime, you guys can feel free to get started on this. And yeah, it is exactly 11. So if you need to head out, then go for it. If you want to stay and like finish up homework or start working on the project or ask me any other questions, then feel free. I will be vibing here for a while. Yes. Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks, Vicky.
Yeah, of course.
Wait, I had a question.
Yes.
For your transformation demo, I think I saw like the icons kind of like coming through the left. Like, how'd you do that?
Let's see. Oh, okay. So like when oh shoot, I messed up the code entirely. Yeah, so you notice that it like kind of flashes on first load, right? Like it transitions in. Yeah, so that's actually a bug in the way that it's not supposed to do that. It just has to do with the way that your script is like ran in the DOM. It's like kind of technical and like I don't really even understand why it does that.
Yeah.
But it's just like it's just something that like happens on default. So if you want it to do that, then it can do that. But if you don't want it to happen,
like, go on purpose, like without like it being buggy or.
Yeah. So there's a way to do that. I'm pretty sure in JavaScript. It shouldn't be too complicated. So it's definitely something you can just like look up and copy and paste code for.
Okay.
If you want to. Yeah. But
curious about
yeah.
that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
For the first homework, I had a question.
Yes.
So I guess I was just a little bit confused because so wait, there's two like homework assignments that we're submitting through Gradescope, right? And we're submitting them both under that one assignment?
Yeah, so it's pretty much just two combined into one. Yeah.
Okay, so like the HTML and CSS, like there's one homework that has HTML and CSS, and then one homework that has just HTML. Is it like we're submitting two HTML files and one CSS file, or
let me check the specs. Give me 1 second.
Or is it like we're using the HTML file that we did in the first homework for the CSS homework in the second one?
That is a great question. Okay, so create two files. I think they're separate. I'm fairly sure they're separate. Yeah. I'm gonna confirm with Irving because I'm pretty sure he wrote most of this, just to make sure. But I'm fairly sure it's they're two separate files.
Okay, so two HTML files and one CSS file.
Yeah, and if that's
Okay.
wrong, like I'll just let him know. It shouldn't be too big of a deal. But yeah, go with that for now.
Okay,
Make
thank
sure.
you.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a quick and maybe stupid question?
Yeah, of course.
You just said at the end of the lecture, just get comfortable using dev tools. You mean HTML and CSS, right?
So dev tools, oh yeah, sorry. I guess I wasn't super clear. So dev tools are essentially, homework is due in an hour, sorry. Yes, it is. However, if that is not possible for you, just let us know. Okay, so dev tools are they're built into Chrome. So it was what I was here. Let me share my screen. Great mistake. You're all good, all good. So for example here. So DevTools is this really weird looking thing on the side here.
Oh, that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Apologies if that wasn't clear. It's something that is built into every browser. So like in Safari, there's DevTools too, but I am definitely biased towards the Chrome ones. It's super nice. You can run like tests on your website and everything.
Oh, I used
but
some
yeah.
of it for my homework. But yeah, okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
for sure.
That was my only question. Thank you so much for the lecture.
Yeah, of course. Have a good one.
You too. Bye bye.